Thank you for coming. My name's Trudy Duffy. I'm the Principal Officer in the Evidence for Policy Unit in the Department of Further Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science, and I promise it's going to be the last time I say that name. As I said, we have a really esteemed panel of colleagues and panellists here. I'm incredibly grateful to them for coming and participating today. And before I allow them to introduce themselves, and I'm sure many of you know them already, what I'm going to do is just set a bit of context and say why we're here today and kind of what we're going to talk about and why we're talking about what we're talking about. So everybody in the room, I'm sure, will be familiar with Impact 2030. Sorry, that's just saying that we'll have a panel discussion. So we're all familiar with Impact 2030. And I actually wrote it down as Impact 2023, so I was obviously doing this in a rush. So forget the left-hand side. Look at the nice picture. There's a nice coloured picture, okay, so we focus on that. Pillar one of Impact 2030 is to strengthen the impact of public research system on policy making. And that's what we're about. And we very kindly, the government very nicely name-checked us in one of their strategies. So they said the Evidence for Policy Unit in the Department of Further Higher Education will actually do this for us. So, bit of pressure. And what I want to talk about is kind of what we are as a unit, what we want to do as a unit, and then my colleagues here are going to tell us what happens in practice. So just explaining what the Evidence for Policy Unit is, what we do, and what we try to do. If you look at this, this is a hypothetical department that has units called, I don't know, higher education policy, research programs. You may be familiar with some of these. So each of these policy units tend to operate in silos, very much collegiate. We're organised into divisions. You know, within those divisions, we work quite closely together. You know, we do have linkages across all those different policy areas. Some of those policy areas are really good at engaging with research. And I'm going to point out our Skills Planning and Enterprise Engagement Unit. So they have advisory structures. They have the expert group on future skills need. They have a research program ongoing with the ESRI. So they have a longitudinal program kind of in collaboration, and the projects under that program are developed in collaboration with researchers in the ESRI. So they're good at doing this stuff. They have science advice in terms of expert advisory mechanisms, and they have a research program. But the other units might be engaged in a bit of research, probably have, you know, stand up, stand down, expert advisory groups. But as a kind of a group, as an organisation, we're not consistent in how we engage with research. So this is my unit down the bottom. So on the left, and sorry, Bree, on the left we have data and statistics. So Oliver Ratcliffe looks after data and statistics, and he's trying to pull the data and the available data and work at the CSO to make sure data is available on what happens across the system. Can we leverage administrative data, and how can we get access to that information? Keane, next down, is economic analysis and evaluation. So Keane and his team are all sourced from the Government Economic and Evaluation Service. So we want to free them up to be able to do evaluation. We have Ciara, who's sitting here in the front, who I want everybody in this room to get to know, because Ciara is our sectoral research lead. So Ciara is interested in everything that you are doing in relation to any of the policy areas that we were talking about. And I genuinely mean that. And we published our research priorities with a kind of in July this year, with a big proviso saying, just because these are the big research priorities doesn't mean we're not interested in everything else that could impact on us as a department. And Ciara's role is to try and package up the research that's out there, try and create engagement with people across the sector, package that research and shove it at the policy units at the right time. Okay, because people doing policy are busy. They don't have time to go out to the conferences, they don't have time a lot of times to do direct engagement with researchers. But if we can get the information to them at the right time, we can really deliver change and evidence-informed change. And I won't go into, I think the whole policy development process is for another day. So I suppose this is what happens in government departments on a day-to-day basis. And then if we think about that as a model for an exemplar kind of government department, and if you think of that, instead of looking at different policy silos within the department, think of each of those boxes as different departments. and policy silos for government. So we have all those different government departments. We have the IGSS, represented by Ollie on the left, who is seconded from the IGSS, so from the Government Statistical Service. We have Keen and we have the IGES, Irish Government Economic and Evaluation Service. So we have a support structure for the evaluation side. There's nothing under Ciara's name on that list. We don't have a support structure for engagement with the research community. And this is where Leonora on the right-hand side comes in. And this is where this consultation comes in, and this is where the work that we're doing comes in. Can we create the structures to support that research engagement at a systemic level across the civil service? And that's why we're here today. And this is why we're doing the work that we're doing. And this is why the Evidence for Policy Unit has been name-checked in that strategy. So no pressure on Leonora, who unfortunately can't be here today, but we're recording and she'll see it. So that's what we're trying to do as an Evidence for Policy Unit. So the next time we're talking about people, there's a support structure under Ciara and the other research leads in the department. And that there are research leads in other departments. Because the work that we've been doing demonstrate that like every department has a different structure, and rightly so. We're all doing different jobs and we all need different evidence bases. But can we make sure that there is that solid foundation that we can all tap into? We're not starting from scratch. You're all aware of this. There's a huge amount of work ongoing in the institutions, in the representative bodies, in the funding agencies, about how we can create those connections and that connectivity. We have a vast number of, almost every institution has an impact program, has a research impact program. We can see sourcing of science advice is there, evidence base for the tertiary sector, that's our paper. Can I encourage everybody to read that and talk to Ciara? Call for expert evidence. Jennifer might cover this one for us. She went out and asked researchers what they had. So all this work is ongoing, so we're not starting from anywhere. So what we need to do is try and put a bit of structure on it. So we were at the left, which is all that dispersed activity, and the smart art wouldn't let me put in enough bubbles to represent all the activity that was going on, but I think the concept is there. Where we are is somewhere in the middle at the moment. So we've created a structure for the civil service, and we call it the Civil Service Research Network. So we're bringing together all the government departments for the first time to talk about research and to talk about common areas of research and what the civil service side needs out of the research and the difficulties that we have in engaging with yourselves. We also have the higher education and research sector. We're trying to bring that together, and we have a representative group and funding agencies and the HEA and the IRC. Sorry, the IRC is funding agency, but the THEA and IUA and all our representative organisations are on that. And that was an effort to start bringing together some of the work that's happening on the higher ed side. And we also had our consultation, which we're here to talk about today, and the learnings that we have from that consultation. So we're bringing together, we're trying to categorise what's going on, make sure that there are structures so that when we all come together, we know what each other are talking about, we know what the structures are on either side, and we can work together to fill in the gaps to see what will work for all of us. Because it's one thing, if you say to increase your research impact, you need to speak kind of loudly and clearly to the policymakers and they'll take it on board. But the policy side are like, no space, no time, timing wrong. This would have been great 2 months ago because we've just developed a policy. You know, so we need to get the timing, we need to get the engagement, we need to get the structures to create that ongoing engagement in place. So that'll lead us to a framework for engagement, magically, towards the first quarter of next year. And then when I was looking at this earlier today, I thought there should be another hour because what happens then? And then we get to the really fun bit. Because then we get to what are the national challenges and how do we address those? And how can we get government departments and you know, interdisciplinary kind of research groups together to talk about some of those? And how do we find out what's happening there already? Because we're not, like, like even when we go and look at the policy, like we're actually developing policy here and you can see how much activity there is in that space already that we don't want to damage. So when we're looking at other challenges that face the state, there's work ongoing there already. How do we find out what's going on? How do we bring it together? And how do we identify the gaps and address the gaps? And that's where we want to be this time next year when I'm talking to you. That we have structures in place, we're starting to move towards how do we address the challenges. We had an open consultation because if you're in a government department, you do open consultation. It ran from end July to the end of September, and we knew July was a bad time and we knew August was a bad time, so we ran it out to the end of September. We had a lot of people opening it and saying, here's my name and keep me informed as to what's going on. We had about half the people actually gave us submissions. More than half of those were representative bodies, which is great. But we really wanted to hear from individual researchers because we so rarely get to communicate directly with researchers. And like, this is why myself and Ciara are here, and we've been here for the last 2 days trying to talk to people to find out what's going on, to find out what your needs are. You know, so we would have liked to see more responses from individual researchers. What we did get is some incredibly generous people who sent us emails to the department and said, I'd love to respond to your consultation, but I work in science, I'm not involved in policy, I don't know what you mean. Like, you know, policy is a big black box, I don't know where to start. You know, so we had other people who filled in the thing and said, don't know where to start, you know, not aware of anything going on here. And that was an incredibly important finding. And the level of response was an incredibly important finding because we didn't get our communication channels right. We went out through the research offices, we went on gov.ie, because I know you all follow gov.ie on a regular basis to find out what the open consultations are. And I know that you're specifically chasing my LinkedIn to find out what's going on and the department's LinkedIn, just in case there happens to be an open consultation on research. So we didn't get our comm strategy right, and we have to do better with that. So what we're here today to talk about is some examples of how people are engaging with policy. And we have 2 people here from government departments, and we have 2 researchers as well, representing the research side, just to give you their experience. So what do we mean by engaging with policy? And you can see from earlier, we have, there's science advice and all the really sexy stuff, okay? And I know somebody at some stage is going to ask me about the government science advisor. And they fit in, it's a science advisor to government who can tap into expertise, whether it's on an immediate basis or looking at strategic foresight, as requested by government. But all this mechanism goes on in departments on a day in, day out basis, trying to provide the best evidence to our ministers to allow them make good decisions. So we're talking about the day in, day out, creating connectivity, like getting the research in at the basic level of here's evidence, here's a good idea, here's what we, you know, here are our recommendations. So we're not talking about the science advice stuff, which is really good and really important. We're talking about that day to day, making sure that what we send up the line for decision making is well evidenced, okay? So that's what we're here today to talk about. The reason we're videoing it is because we'd like to put this online afterwards. We will not be videoing the questions and answers, just to give people a bit of freedom to ask what they want to ask. And as I said, we need to get our comms right the next time we're going out. So we will be doing more consultation in kind of January, February. We'll be running some workshops, and then we go for the framework for engagement. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our panel to introduce themselves. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Hi everyone, I'm Jennifer Brennan. I'm leading Research and Innovation Strategy for the Department of the Environment, Climate and Communications. I'm very new to the civil service. I was here at the SFI Summit last year and I still worked for the Technological Higher Education Association at that stage. So brand new civil servant, getting used to the new environment that I'm in. And I suppose our focus in the department really is how we can really engage with this evidence for policy agenda. We have pockets of good practice around engaging with researchers, one of them sitting next to me here, Brian Ó Gallachóir, but we could do a lot better, I think, as a department. And so that's really what we're trying to activate. And the other area of responsibility of mine is the Research and Innovation chapter in the annual Climate Action Plan, which we'll hopefully be finishing off today. And yeah, I think we had a call for evidence through that process, which, you know, similar to Trudy's consultation, you know, we didn't really get a whole lot back from the research community on that. And maybe people feel that we don't read them, but we absolutely do. We go through them with a fine-tooth comb and we look for things that are interesting and we try to follow up on them and bring them into the things that we're developing. So really looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Hi everybody, I'm Lorraine Leeson and I am a Professor in Deaf Studies at Trinity College Dublin. My work for, I'm feeling old now when I say over 30 years, has been around the promotion and investigation of sign languages and taking that from multidisciplinary perspectives. My other hat is I'm Associate Vice Provost for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at Trinity. So on the other side of things, it's about how do we engage people in policy development within an institution and influence change in that ways too.
Hello everyone, delighted to be here. Thanks for the invitation, Trudy. Brian Ó Gallachóir, I'm Associate Vice President of Sustainability at University College Cork. I'm also the Director of MaREI, the SFI Research Centre for Energy, Climate and Marine. I have a number of other hats, but I won't go into them just now. I suppose my research career has focused on developing energy systems modelling tools and using them to inform policy. So from the start, I had that as a dual goal in what I wanted to achieve. At the time, there wasn't an evidence for policy unit, so most of the things I learned were by trial and error, with a lot of error in that. And I suppose the first kind of major success was probably in 1998 from the perspective of that transference to policy. So I was invited to draft a couple of chapters for what was to become the Green Paper on Sustainable Energy at that stage. So I've had an ongoing set of engagements and interactions with the policy system. I've kind of developed a 7-point plan. I don't know if I have time for that, so I'll leave that that could be a question. But just a couple of reflections, I think, from that sort of, you know, reflecting on those years of engagement. One is I had to decide what role I wanted to play, because researchers can play a number of roles in engaging with the policy system. But two, I would draw your attention to is some researchers use their research to lobby for change, and that's a legitimate use of research. That isn't the role that I wanted to take. What I wanted to do was see how the research could support the policy system, increasing the evidence base, so working within the system, if you like, rather than lobbying from the outside. The second thing is when we talk about the policy system and the evidence for policy unit and some of the things Trudy mentioned, there is that engagement with policymakers in terms of the civil service. But it's also important, I mean, one of the important learnings for me was that engaging with the other part of the policy system, politicians, is very different. And I think that's important to just recognise that. So yeah, I'll leave it at that for now, but really looking forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Ciara Pidgeon and I head up the Research and Evaluation Unit in the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. And as you can tell from that title, we cover a very wide range of policy areas. It's a department that's grown massively in the last number of years, and our unit's role is to try and ensure that policy developed by our department is informed by the best available research. We also have a kind of a unique role in that we look after the Growing Up in Ireland longitudinal study, which involves 3 cohorts. Well, from next year we've got new babies coming on board and goes right up to the age of 25. So that's really, really great information about 1/3 of the population. So we promote the use of that amongst the wider research community, and we use it for our own purposes within the department. We place a lot of emphasis, and we're trying to improve our work around inclusive research. So involving people with disabilities, children, various different groups in the research process. And I think as government, you know, and civil service, we have a lot of power in what questions are asked. So it's important that we are inclusive in the questions that we are asking and what research we prioritise. Within our department, so because, you know, we've a lot of staff, some individuals in different policy units would be well connected with the research community, may have a research background themselves. Others don't have any experience of research whatsoever. So we host research clubs on a regular basis, which bring researchers in for discussions with the civil servants, just to bring those two worlds together and have a casual opportunity to explore what the different issues are. And I suppose I'd be very keen that all our staff in the department are confident and capable in using research to inform their work, and that takes a bit of consideration.
So just taking up that, like looking at, you were saying we want people across the departments to be able to use research. Jennifer, your side invests, you're one of the big spenders in research. You've got a really critical policy area, who's not interested in climate. What mechanisms has DEC got in place to facilitate research and to allow people engage with research from the policy practitioner side? And the reason I say policy practitioners is the government and the ministers are the decision makers, they're the policy makers. And I suppose that's why I always talk about policy practitioners when I'm talking about all building the evidence base to hand up for good decision making.
Thanks. Yeah, well, look, there's a couple of different ways, I guess, that we engage with research, and I've kind of written them down so I wouldn't forget them all. But I suppose that the first thing that we do is we would commission research directly, sometimes from the research community. So we have a group that we call the Climate Action Modelling Group, and that's a series of 5 kind of long-term contracts, 4 to 5 years in duration, which we do through a procurement process, and Brian's organisation holds one of those, and they do modelling related to the Climate Action Plan and inform some of that work. We also have long-term contracts with the ESRI, which look at certain areas. Like, people tend to think about our department as the climate department, but we're environment, climate and communications and telecommunications advancement is just as important as those other areas. We also have the National Cybersecurity Centre under our remit as well, and so we're kind of at the heart of that green and digital twin transition thing that Horizon Europe is so keen on. So the ESRI does some work for the communication side of the house for us as well. We also can, I guess, source research through our state bodies. So organisations like the EPA, SEAI, Inland Fisheries Ireland have themselves got evidence and research units, and we work with them to source various bits and pieces of research that we need. We also are funding research, so people know us for that. So there's the annual EPA research calls and SEAI research calls. And particularly with the EPA, we have a really good relationship where we have topics, we can propose topics to be included in those calls. And our staff then from the policy side, and we have a group of technical advisors, would sit on the steering committees for those projects. And the EPA has recently started working on a project called EPA Impact, where they're trying to parcel up the results of those projects in such a way that they're accessible to policymakers, and they're making videos and they're making policy briefs. Because for a long time, EPA, and anyone who's ever had an EPA project in the room knows you have to produce a fairly long and detailed policy-focused report at the end. But the policymakers don't have time to read a 60-page report about a research project. They want to know the main messages in 2 pages. And if it's interesting, they may look at the main policy report. So they're working on that area as well. So those are really the ways that we're looking at, I suppose, supporting and commissioning research. The difficulty that we have at the moment, and I suppose picking up on something that Ciara said, it's about, for us, building up research skills and knowledge among our staff. So we're developing a strategy at the moment for research and innovation, and we did quite a lot of work speaking to our staff. So we basically did a very good staff survey. We got a pretty good 25% response rate from 600 people. Is not bad. We also did a workshop with our staff as well. We brought in a professional facilitator to do a design thinking workshop. And the thing that came across really clearly was that our staff are very interested in research, but they don't feel that they have the skill set and the knowledge to basically work with it and use it. So we are very inspired by the things we hear from City and other departments like health around things like research clubs. Some of the other things I'm sure that Ciara will talk about are sort of like how-to guides and blogs about research. So we're looking to try to build up that within our department so that we have the capability and our staff have the confidence that they know where to look, and that we have people in the department people like me, that they can come to and say, well, how do I find this information? So that's really kind of our focus at the moment. And ideally what I suppose we'd like to see is a system where our people, as I said, feel confident to go out and engage with researchers, but we also want to have that other way. We want researchers to feel confident about approaching us, and I think we do need to do a little bit of work around things like our CAP call for evidence, for example, which I mentioned, which we really didn't get that much response to. And again, that's probably a communications thing. It's down to how do we disseminate these things and how do we let people know that they're actually available and that we really welcome their views, whether they are a big research centre, you know, in energy modelling, or whether they're just an individual researcher who has a really cool idea who wants to kind of communicate that to the department. So that's what we're trying to achieve.
It's me, Jennifer. I think there's a lot of commonalities. Like, I think when we sit with the research network, we kind of sit and we're like, yeah, we have that problem too. And I know one of the challenges that Ciara has had on our side is getting people to talk about research in the department. And we're all talking about doing workshops and getting people excited about research when they're in the middle of all that policy kind of pressure coming at them. So Lorraine, from your side, you know, what's it like trying to tap back in? And you've experienced not only at the national level, but very much at the European level as well. So I think when we're talking about that research engagement, it's not just a national issue. And I know the Commission is doing a lot of work as well in terms of capacity development and how can we, and just to get my terminology right, so the Europeans call it science for policy. We, because of historical reasons that will now no longer be relevant, I called it research for policy to make sure that we're inclusive of all, and people are very clear that we were inclusive of all research. And I know the last chat that I had with somebody from the Commission, they're now thinking going to research for policy because they saw my point. So Lorraine, your experience from, I suppose, national and the international level.
Sure. Well, I had the very good fortune of spending a couple of years working with an NGO based in Brussels called the European Union of the Deaf, which is the deaf community-led umbrella organisation of deaf people. So I had master classes from deaf people who were leading the charge to have sign languages included in the planning for International Year of Languages, if you remember that, back around 2001. And the people who I was working with, they taught me how to talk to people, the power of one-to-one conversations, the need to be able to tell a story very clearly, a research story, and then to be able to work maybe with activists or community leaders, in my case that's really important, to try and bring together the evidence for policy that will bring about the changes that were required. So we did quite a lot of work. I did quite a lot of work subsequently with the Council of Europe, with their language policy unit, initially looking to look at the position of sign languages in education across Council of Europe territories. And then later on, following from that, building on, it was probably an 8 years worth of work with the European Centre for Modern Languages, working to have sign languages incorporated into the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. So if you can imagine, like, we went from a point where in Ireland as well, you know, I'm trained as a linguist and as an interpreter. When we would go to talk about the need for Irish Sign Language recognition or the need for funding to train sign language interpreters, we would meet officials from various departments and from political parties who would say, but where's the evidence this is even a language? So you were starting from that point of reference where it was about saying, well, okay, let me tell you about verb structures, shall I? You know, or do you want to know about passive constructions? So, you know, we could do, you know, that part of the research that then gave a standing point. But all of that then, those building blocks were very important when it came to the conversations that said, like with the lead for DG, I can't even remember now what it was, DG, Democracy, Education and Culture at the Council of Europe. You know, we were saying, well, you're building this new Common European Framework of Reference for Language, a companion volume around about 2019 to 2020. You want to put a reference to sign languages as an appendix. Over coffee, we had the conversation that said, look, you know, if you're talking about this as a Common European Framework for Languages, don't you think that all languages need to be included? And literally it was the coffee conversation that got the buy-in that said, yes, let's do this. And then the work could follow. So it's not just about having the evidence, I think, it's also about having the opportunity to be in the room, to tell the story, to build rapport, and to maybe have, you know, another body of research that you can bring to bear that comes to support the tale. In the Irish context then, you know, the work that we were doing with colleagues at the Centre for Deaf Studies around deaf people's access to justice, deaf people's access to policing, to healthcare, informed conversations such as the House of the Oireachtas had an Equality Committee discussion in 2016 that found deaf people were amongst the most marginalised in Ireland. And in 2017, finally, after about 30 years worth of work and a lot of evidence that had to be presented to various parties, we managed to have Irish Sign Language recognised in the Irish Sign Language Act. So that Act only commenced formally in 2020, but now still the work that we've been doing through research has informed the establishment of a Register of Irish Sign Language Interpreters. It has informed An Garda Síochána just in the past few weeks have issued instruction to members of An Garda Síochána around the use of an Irish Sign Language caution. Can you imagine there wasn't any caution in Irish Sign Language for deaf people for all this time? And instruction around the need to use appropriately qualified interpreters. So that really is seeing the research to policy to practice piece, but it requires a lot of conversations. And I think you also have to be very patient, because in my experience, it takes probably a good 8 to 10 years to go from the initial conversation to actually seeing the policy piece coming to the fore.
I think it's really interesting, you know, first of all, you mentioned kind of 30 years worth of work, and then you were like, this took 10 years. And I know one of the conversations that we're having internally is research impact. And how do you demonstrate impact? And you can see sometimes how long. It's not about the publications, it's about that longitudinal relationship, ongoing development of incremental evidence, and then it builds and it builds and it builds. So when somebody turns around, in particular, we get very sensitive about public expenditure and reform and having evidence to prove what we need there, because that's the only way we can get money. You know, we need that evidence. We need that evidence base to be able to not fight, but to be able to make a cogent argument that funding in this area is a good thing. You know, particularly important when we're talking about research impact, and I'm looking at the group of people in the room. So that was really good kind of, I suppose, story about how you as an individual and how, you know, that relationship building, and you didn't have the support of a huge, big machine behind you. And I'm going to look at mine and say you have things like MaREI in a big area, in a very sexy area that people are involved in, and Jennifer is sitting here and has a relationship already, you know, that we know about MaREI. You're not fighting to get in those doors. Technically, those doors should be more open. So could you share your experience, please?
Well, I think that time is a key one that you mentioned, and actually you mentioned it as well, because time is a valuable commodity on both sides in terms of the researchers and the policy makers. So making the time available on both sides is one of the key challenges, I think. And for the research system, I think it's about valuing that time spent. And similarly on the policy system, it's about valuing the time spent by the policy practitioners in engaging with research. We've developed a kind of a 7-step kind of process, and as you say, we're very fortunate. Like the centres, the research centres have been a game changer in this, in terms of providing that research support infrastructure to allow us to engage not only with policy but with industry and with citizens and communities. And but that was something that wasn't available to me when I started on this journey. So there was a lot of time taken building trust and trial and error. But what we've managed to achieve then, since the MaREI Centre has formed, is kind of increasing that impact significantly. And in terms of the different stages of the journey, the first one is actually to do the research and get it peer reviewed and make it openly available, because it does, one of our key areas is to strive for research excellence, not just in its own right, but it's more valued then in the policy making process and by others. So that's the first step. The second one is this engagement piece, and that involves and this is where maybe lobbying and supporting are different, because rather than telling policy makers what they should do with the research, it's about listening to policy practitioners to understand what their needs are, and then trying to use that as a starting point. So engagement is a critical part in the journey. The third one then is undertaking then specific analysis, specific pieces of analysis that meet the needs. And timeliness, you mentioned, comes in here. It's important. And the timeliness factor is a very difficult one to to correctly address. But being responsive to the policy questions that are there and doing analysis that helps to inform or shine a light on those, I think is critically important. The fourth piece then is translating the research results into policy insights. One of our earlier pieces in 2013, we produced the first low carbon energy roadmap for Ireland. It was 153 pages long. I doubt if many of the policy practitioners or policy makers read it, but it did provide confidence in the policy system to legislate for climate action 2 years later. And that's an important value of that type of analysis. But the translation piece is also hugely important, translating into insights to make it more digestible, to get the bullet points, to get the clear insights. And policy briefs play a huge role in that. And this is again where MaREI has been hugely helpful in having people who are expert at kind of being able to develop those in an accessible and readable way. So it's not just the text and the insights, but it's how it's presented. And that's the fifth point, which is that improving the communications. And this is an ongoing journey. I think infographics have been a game changer in that for us in terms of how to communicate some of the policy insights from the analysis that we do. The seventh area is co-production of policy, and this is a tricky one because the policy practitioners and the policy makers and the researchers all have different but complementary roles. So how does co-production work in that context? And it can, and it's appropriate for certain types of areas of policy, and maybe less so for others. So that's an important one to tease out. But we've got very useful experience. I think one of the examples I can think of here is the carbon budgets. The carbon budgets were proposed by the Climate Change Advisory Council to government. The Climate Change Advisory Council set up a working group to develop the analysis that they need. And so within that, we had researchers, including myself, involved in a working group. The Climate Change Advisory Council proposed those to government. The Oireachtas Committee had an engagement with us on those. And one of the things that was fascinating to me in terms of policy development in climate action was in 2022, that was approved by the Oireachtas without the need for a vote. And you're talking about something like 3 years previously, only 2 politicians had been speaking about climate change, and one of those didn't believe in climate change. So the change in terms of that no, there's a whole groundswell of other things that kind of sort of led to that as well. But that evidence coming at the right time and that co-production piece, again, provided that confidence to the system. And the seventh piece is building absorptive capacity in the policy system. This is something that we've been working on over the last number of years. And it's about trying to find mechanisms where we can make ourselves available to the policy makers, but also finding the bridging points where the policy makers can have time to engage with us. And this can be, simple things like the fellowships in both directions, providing a safe space for policymakers to ask what might be considered stupid questions. That's a key part in this, in terms of that trust. And as you were saying earlier, Jennifer, sometimes they mightn't even know what the questions are, but feeling comfortable and feeling that it's a safe space to ask questions, I think is hugely important. So that building absorptive capacity is the final piece. It's still very much a work in progress, and I think so I was delighted to see the unit being set up and Jennifer's team in DEC, because these are parts of that infrastructure to enable that to happen. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. And of course, Ciara's unit, which she's been telling us
Sorry,
about. And
yes,
I have to say, as a civil servant, we all look at these city because they have a really good structure. And Ciara's spoken to us about, you're in charge of growing up in Ireland. Do you know, I think every researcher in the room kind of went, oh, really? How do we get at that? If you're not kind of in the middle of mining information from it already. But Ciara, you're a relatively recent move into that unit. So you've been doing policy, and then you get moved into a unit that's talking about the evidence and the research base. Has your opinion of evidence and the research base changed because you've gone into a unit?
Yes and no. I suppose, so before I joined the Research and Evaluation Unit in September, so bear with me, I'm still learning the language. I worked in parenting and family support policy in the current department, and before that I worked across a lot of policy areas in the Department of Health. So I've had kind of a broad experience as a civil servant of policy or of research. I've worked in areas where it felt like there wasn't much research available to inform decisions. And I don't know if that was necessarily the case, but that was the sense back then. Now I'm talking 20 years ago in a particular area. I've also worked in areas where there's been very few Irish researchers. You know, I worked in a particular policy area and there was 2 guys in the country, and you kind of knew what the work was going to say in advance. And you know, so we had to be kind of careful in how we might use that. And then there's other areas where the research feels overwhelming and huge. I think someone made a point earlier around that lifting of things from other countries into Ireland. So, you know, somebody might be advocating and promoting research from other countries, and as a policy maker, you're often going, oh, well, our health service is completely different, or, you know, our structures, you know, so it's good research, we will take it on board, but more thinking is needed. And then I suppose, unfortunately, there is no linear policy making process. So, you know, I often think of research as a multi-purpose tool. Sometimes you're using it to shine a light on an area and get a sense of what the situation is. What are the problems that we need to think about? You know, and that's hugely valuable. Other times you have a particular problem and you're absolutely thrilled if there's research that tells you what the good answers might be. And then sometimes, and I absolutely take on board the point about policy making can seem very slow, can be very slow. Sometimes that's to do with, you know, structural things. Legislation takes time. The opportunity only arises sometimes. So it's important that we're strategic in our thinking about research, and we're not just trying to answer the current problem at hand, but put in place that wider infrastructure so that, you know, in 10 years' time, when new problems arise, we have a body of work to rely on. So one thing we're going to be doing next year is starting work on a cross-government research programme for children and young people. And we're currently working with NUIG to identify gaps that are there at the moment. The other thing as a policy maker is research. We're not the only ones using research. The lobby groups and the stakeholders are using research, and they can be selective in their choice of research, and they can be better at communicating than we are. So sometimes there is a bit of a battle there, you know, around communicating policies and decisions. And then the other thing that is so important is that look back. Are we getting it right? And research has a huge role to play in holding, you know, us as civil servants to account and the government to account, and are the things we're doing working, and are we getting it right? And that's a hugely important and valuable role for research. It may not be may not feel the most innovative or cutting edge, but it's a really important function that we value immensely.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with everything you're saying, except for, like, I went through policy areas, and I have to admit, research wasn't top of my agenda when I was collating evidence to start developing the policy. So you're well ahead of me.
And just, I have to say it, growing up in Ireland, we're holding workshops early in December for anyone who's interested in finding out more about it.
See, did you know that you were going to get so many sales pitches for evidence in the one day? No, I think that's really, really helpful. And I think one of the things that you're kind of bringing forward is the need from our side to actually be open to engaging with research. You know, I think one of the things that we've been doing is asking people what they need, and they're kind of going, don't know, can't think that far forward, busy dealing with crisis. And we're trying to get people to think, if you had different evidence available, what kind of things would you like to look at? You know, or, you know, people they'll typically come back and say, don't have the data for that, can't look at it. And you're like, well, have we mentioned that we have a statistician hooked into the CSO? Maybe if we don't have the data available, is that not what you call a research project? Go and create the new information, create the new evidence, look to see where the gaps are. Don't keep moaning that there's information gaps there, when we can go out and actually generate new information. And that's really exciting if we can get people to think that way. So listen, thanks very much for your attention. Thanks very much for coming on.